One of the ideas I had when I started this class is I wanted class participation like on the last day, which means you take one of the learning objectives that I had on the syllabus and talk about that, or there might be an italicized sentence or paragraph in the progress or poverty. You might want to talk about that. I just want a demonstration that you read the material, understand it, and share it, and I think you'll get more out of it if you stand up and talk. So, just keep that in mind, and if you have something that you want to present on the last day, and you want to talk about it, or tell me at some point, that'd be good. And I passed out earlier the class notes on for today, and I go into the two papers about the fisheries. Now what you'll see in these class notes, and you'll recognize that I didn't have a handout for the class 2 class notes. I just got tied up with stuff. So I'm going to finish this up. You can see that this is an abridged version of Progress and Poverty. So what I was doing was taking even more abridged. I was just printing out the sentences that I think were most relevant for each of the chapters. It's important for me to have that broken out, because once you study it and you put it together, I think you start finding real gems of what Henry George was trying to get at. So I'll be going into that. I hope that we have enough time to talk about this article. It's called "I'm Not Evil, I'm a Landlord." And I thought maybe somebody could stand up and do a critique of what his paradigm is and what might be an alternate paradigm within a Georgist outlook. Let's see. So before I get started, I was asked a question from the last material from last week, and it had to do with the definition of Cameralism. So within the German tradition of economics, the economist, or you might call the financial advisors to the prince and the kings, they were called the Cameralists, and it's because supposedly the money for the kingdom was in an area called the Camera, so they were the ones in charge and advising the king and the prince on the best use of the money. In my opinion, the Cameralists and the German School of Economics, called the various names that have been thrown out, I think they've been given like a wrong critique to be dismissed as so-called mercantilists, as if all they're concerned about is trade in gold and silver and all these kind of things. But there is that aspect of trade in those days. The Cameralists were more concerned about the internal development of the country and the people. You have to understand that the Cameralist tradition, exhibited by that guy named Horneck, who I presented material on, it was he wrote those nine points of economic development 40 years after the end of the 30 Years' War. So 30 Years' War in Europe decimated up to like 70% of populations in certain areas. So they came together and said, we need to build our country up so that we're not fighting anymore, that we can be unified, so that when other people come in to take us over, we've got a strong economy. So that's what those 9 points were. So Cameralists advised the powers that be, and that time you had kings and princes. And the smart kings and princes listened to these guys because they were in with the people and said, if we only had this, that, and the other thing, we'd be better off. So it was kind of like listening to what the people in the society were needing. And they would do the kind of things that would be smart today, like maybe free education, maybe good health care, all the kind of things that you would need to have a healthy population back in those days, so that when somebody did attack your area, you had a loyal population that was willing to fight for you. There weren't no mercenaries and that. So there was a method to the madness of what these Cameralists were advising to do. And the point that I was making, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, last Friday when I made my presentation to the conference called The Next System, was that this was all about development economics, and it's how do you go to this new system from the old system that's obvious to a lot of people isn't working. So even though the Cameralist German economic model is like 300 years old, it's a good model that we should use now to look to the future, because the era of free trade and the TPP and the monopolization of factors of production, that it kind of opens up the avenue for new thinking. So last week also, I didn't really get into a whole lot of what my dissertation was about. I did talk a little bit about Ostrom's 8 principles for a common pool resource management system. And this is the thinking that was missing from the authors who were voicing the fisheries economists' points of view. You might have caught that if you're reading the article. What Ostrom and Bromley get into is that there is a definite way of managing things in common, managing things collectively. It's not a free-for-all. So when you read, for example, Garrett Hardin, and he talks about tragedy of the commons, he's talking about the tragedy when nobody owns anything and you go in there and you grab it and then you find that there's nothing there. Well, that condition really never happens unless you have somebody who's very careless with resources. Usually somebody owns something or somebody's getting a value for something. So what Ostrom had found was that everywhere in the world, across cultures and geography, these 8 principles appear when resources are successfully managed in a collective fashion. That you have clear boundaries, you know who's there, the rules for how you operate, arrangements for collective choice, institutions, monitoring, sanctions, conflict resolution, and then working with a hierarchy of organizations. So if you're in California, you might do your thing one way. If you're in Louisiana, you do it another way, but you have to respect the location where you're at. So I wanted to point out that, but that is kind of like when people in an area with a resource figure out that let's commonly share these resources because that's the best way to sustain them. What I did in my dissertation research, and I gave you a handout, in fact there's a few extras if you don't have it. This is this B right here. This is really the contribution that I made to the literature. That when you have a situation that hasn't gotten to this point, what do you need to happen in order for a coalition, a coalescence of the situation so that it goes to there? You really can't make a positive change in society unless there's disputes. I think Rahm Emanuel was famous for saying in 2008 or 9, when he had this financial crisis, he said that you shouldn't let a crisis go to waste. Well, now, did Obama allow a crisis go to waste? I mean, do we find anything that's changed since 2008-9? I mean, we got Dodd-Frank, but I mean, these guys are in the pockets of the bankers, so how can you expect legislation to come out and be, fixing the problem? But I guess the point I made last week was there was a chart that showed the Bailin process. So it's important to understand the Bailin process to better understand what we were going through in the bailout process. These guys must be experts from Madison Avenue or something like oh, I don't like bailouts, so how about a bail-in? You know, it's like, so the bail-in is like 100 times worse, 1,000 million billion, because what's going on is that banks are charging to have money in the bank. So it's like you deposit $100 and they charge you $10 just to hold on to it, which once you understand the Werner thesis, that's totally insane, because when they make loans, they're making it out of thin air. So it's like making it out of thin air and they're charged. So one of the charts that I showed last week, and then I showed it at the next system, was that there's $2 quadrillion worth of stock, bonds, and derivatives, mostly as derivatives. So these obligations that are neither wealth, they're not money, they're just obligations that are weighing down the whole world economic system. And they're taking this bail-in money to try to address this thing, but there's no way that you can steal enough money to pay off these obligations. So that's really where we stand with the 2008, 2009. So the world didn't blow up, so I guess on that score, maybe Obama did okay. I really didn't want to spend a whole lot of time critiquing Obama and such. But I did want to finish my contribution to the literature in terms of the Ostrom thesis and common pool resources. So we all agree that you don't make real change unless there's a dispute. Like in Tampa that I studied, there was water wars. People were spending millions of dollars just on water lawyers so that they'd maintain the rights that they had, rather than spending $1 million to build something or to filter it or something like that. So that was the one thing that was in the transitioning to usually a state-managed system to one that's common pool. So it's like government directed to one where the users kind of define it and operate it. Improved understanding of economics. In the case of Tampa, it was improved understanding of water. So once they understand where it's flowing, where it's going, they can come up with the measures. Favorable social and political climate. So in Tampa, there was a climate for change, and there was a model available that Eleanor Ostrom knew about in California, and the guy who was leading that change in Tampa knew about that mechanism. And then the individual initiative taken to cause change. So this is the big problem in American politics is, it's kind of like the George theorem about the least effort. So Ibrahim, reiterate the axiom of Henry George.
Yeah, I think you are right.
People like to
satisfy the desire with the least exertion.
Yeah.
Exertion.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So in a lot of our ideas, that means sitting on the couch hoping that political change happens. That's the perverse way of understanding the Henry George theorem. But I think in terms of this, that individual initiative needs to happen to say, we need to do this, and I'm going to run for office, and here's my platform. Because if one person doesn't do that, then there's no mechanism for the change to happen. In Henry George's way of doing it, it was more of I think he was expressing a scientific principle of this is how people work in the long run. He wasn't advocating a political position. His whole philosophy rolled from that one idea that human desires are satisfied with the least exertion.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, we all remember the definition of who Georgists are. I put it in the class notes again. Let me read it, because I didn't get any disagreement. I said that, what is Georgist economics? It's capitalism without monopoly, where common property is respected, protected, and secure. So as Georgists, we're not anti-capitalists. So let me get back to this and maybe finish it up. So the last point was it may require personal sacrifice for a more secure future. I think it was in the I always get these things mixed up. I saw the Michael Moore movie, Where Do We Invade Next, which kind of, I recommend it. It's very good. But I don't think it was there, but it was kind of like the saying of somebody wise saying, let the trouble be resolved in my time rather than my kids' time. You know, like, don't put off problems. You know, well, you know, I guess they'll figure it out. But if you have the opportunity to change things now, it's better to do it now than dump it off to your kids. So those were the factors that need to be in place or in play for something like this to happen. So these things so a common pool resource management system just doesn't come out of nothing. A lot of people try to do it and it doesn't work. I know there's a lot of rivers in Africa that Ostrom goes into. I think she has at least 2 times as many situations where it failed as the ones that worked, and it's just amazing that those 8 principles can be ferreted out. So before I get off this common pool and other things, I'll be getting into it a little bit with the papers. I just want to point out that there's a paper that I'll scan and get to people, but one of the papers that I wrote was cited in this paper, and I was kind of happy about it. The thing that they pointed out was that the typical idea is that common pool resource management systems succeed in a small scale, like a hunting and gathering group, or maybe some place where people aren't part of the culture that we know about in New York City and such. But in my research on Tampa, that 3-county area had like over 2 million people, and they had a common pool resource management system. A lot of people within Tampa may not have realized that they're part of that resource management system, but they were sharing the water resources that fell in Pasco County and Hillsborough County and the river, and then they have a desalination plant. So they chose to give up their individual water resource infrastructure and collectively manage it. And they went through each of these principles. So that was the contribution that I made to the literature, that it doesn't have to be small. People out in the woods in Northern California or something, or Colorado, that it could be people that are living in cities that we know about. So that was what that was all about. I wanted to put this up for the first time. Anybody seen this diagram? I've shown it to people at various times. This is something that I created maybe about 10 years ago, and I think it's relevant to have a mental picture of where we are and where we want to go and where we're trying to avoid. It's called the hope crisis continuum, where you have hope going from like a 0 point here up, but crisis has this inflection here. And if you can imagine that you're just born and you've got 2-parent family and you're eating well and you've got all your vaccinations, so you're a healthy little baby. Crisis is low because you're healthy. Hope is real high. And as you get closer to the end of your life, maybe hope is less high than before. And it's not really a crisis because you've lived a good life of sorts. So what you try to do in your life is to stay on the right side of this hope crisis continuum and understand how your adversaries want to push you on the other side of this line. Monopolists like to push you over here, so you're always in crisis, maybe trying to make your bill, pay your bills. So I think this is a useful mnemonic device to understand the Georgist thesis that if we can collect the land value tax, if we can collect the socially generated wealth, society and people in general can be over here. So it's that quest of, where the crisis point is, and then you might even know that you've passed it over. So what does it take? It's kind of like this inflection point, and it might be implementing a land value tax system. That's the thing that gets society to the good side of that continuum. And that's all I wanted to talk about that, because with that, it kind of gives you an idea of there is important points in time. There's things worthy to fight for, because it's going to get over that hump. Let's see.
How about if the force is too great?
I'm sorry?
How about if the force is too great?
The force is too great?
Force is too great.
Well, I guess it's, Davy and Goliath, all these kind of analogies that you look for the right time. So why don't we start with the abdicating responsibilities paper and the fisheries deceit. As I mentioned last week, Daniel Bromley, who's the author of this paper, we've got a few extras if you have. He was my mentor, and he helped me, kind of steer me into a good direction. Yeah. So one of the things that he's getting at, and anybody who's read the paper is familiar with this diagram. And I think, what was your, Susan? Sandy. So Sandy had a question at the end of last week that was very pertinent, and we'll get into that question. Sandy's question was, well, don't the people who operate small fishing vessels need a good income to pay for all the hard work that they do? Because it's not easy being out at sea and all the dangers and the wind and the tornadoes and with the hurricanes and such. Yeah, so that's an important thing to keep in mind as we talk about the fishing industry, because maybe before we get started talking about this article, is that what Bromley is very critical of are the fisheries economists who seem to be providing cover for the larger industry monopolists. And they make all these arguments using this diagram to essentially say the world's resources are ours, and we need to have this property because that way society's better off. They're saying all these things that Bromley very correctly says are incoherent. Bromley is coming from a position of a true economist, questioning the logic and the use of words of these fisheries economists. So there's 5 deceits. Maybe that's what we can, if you go to the class notes for March 17th. First one is the ownership fetish.
Look at this, right?
Yeah, this is the class notes, March 17th, deceit of fisheries economists. So if you go down to the bottom, abdicating responsibilities paper. So people fish to gain control of a future value. Fish that can be eaten or sold. They overfish because of their desire to control a future value. So when individual fishing quotas are issued, that's like a free gift to these industry people to get a percentage of whatever that total allowable catch is. So the point that Bromley is making in the article is that it's neither necessary or sufficient for fish to be owned, for the fish to be managed efficiently or properly. Yeah, it's not an easy thing to do, to be giving biological advice a complex system like an ocean fishery, because there's different species and there's different growth rates. They might generate so many eggs and maybe a certain percentage grow. So in order to have a sustainable fishery, there has to be a basis of a biologist saying, this is my understanding, this is what you should do. And this is the thing that the fisheries monopolists don't want to listen to. They went, don't worry about it, we've got property rights and we wouldn't want to destroy what we are taking home, 100% of. So what the fishing industry are claiming is really, they're trying to claim an ownership fetish, is the way that Bromley talks about it. So if you imagine like Georgia Pacific, they harvest lumber and timber on federal lands, I think. I think they've got some. So when they bid on lumber, do you think the government just gives it to them free? Or Shell Oil or BP, they bid on oil leases in the Gulf or something. The government just doesn't give it to them free. So, so here we are in a situation where fishermen are getting this gift of a share of the catch. And then they use all these fancy arguments and graphs to say, well, we should get them. And because we own it, we're doing it efficiently. And so that's the ownership fetish. The second deceit was property rights and stewardship. One of the things that he gets into is that there's fisheries in New Zealand and I can't remember, maybe Iceland, but the very successful ones have quite a bit of money spent on observation. So this is a situation where they do have those catch shares and they might even have a biologist. So if private property was such a magical thing and it guarantees these outcomes, why do you need all these people observing? Because that costs money. So I'll be getting into the diagramming of this in a second, but the solution that Bromley eventually gets to is that there should be like an auction for an amount of fish that's based on a biologically determined total allowable catch. And nobody pays anything until they come to the dock and say, well, here's what I caught and here's the money for, for the monitoring and all these other things, and that's an efficient way of doing it. So there's no need to own anything. There's no money up front to secure anything. It's all done at the dockside when the fish come in. The idea of the perpetuity that they need these ownership rights into perpetuity, or else they're not going to be managed sustainably. So it's almost all these arguments that are being pushed out are based on the idea that they need to own something. And if we don't own it, then it's going to be destroyed, which it's kind of like a restatement of the Garrett Hardin thesis that if people don't own things, then they're going to go to ruin. But we all know from Ostrom and Bromley is that people can commonly own things and sustain them with good biology and good management. But I think one of the things that makes the argument for the fisheries economists so strong is that there's a culture of belief that the private markets work, that we need to have this large trade arrangements, that we need to base our economy on moving products from all across the oceans and such, when like the Cameralists would say, well, no, what does our community need? And maybe we should be looking at home first, and once we get our home organized, we can start thinking about trade and such. That's really what the argument was being made of. The the deceit number 4 was the individual fishing quotas and property rights. If you look at the U.S. Congress, they had the, I think it was Magnuson and can't remember the other name, but there's the law of the seas or whatever that law was. But Congress defined a permit system for fisheries. It doesn't say, and it actually explicitly says that the permits to fish are not property. So it's like, even though the law says it's not property, you've got academia and fisheries economists and people in the industry saying, well, no, the individual fishing quotas are property and that's the way it should be, and if we don't have it, it's going to be a disaster for sustainability and all these things. So,
Well, people want to own things.
yeah, you know, it's that ownership fetish, that if I don't get it, somebody else is going to get it. But it's a matter of how we organize society and develop trust. Well, I think what the commercial fishermen have right now is a system of individual fishing quotas, and they do sell these kind of things. So you have this, you know, you have a system in place that's not necessarily working, and so what Bromley is advocating is that you need to rethink how fish are caught and how they're managed and how they're paid for, and I'll get into some of the rent arguments, but just because that's the way it is now, it doesn't mean that that's the optimal way that fishing should be managed. Bromley's argument is that you have a lot of areas where you don't have a sustainable catch, that you don't have a sustainable fisheries, that it's going to ruin, like Garrett Hardin was talking about, but and it's precisely because you don't have a collective plan for ownership. So there's deceits all around, and I guess that's the main point. The last thing was number 5. That's the last deceit. And anybody who wants to take on for the class project to discuss the difference between economic rent, Ricardian rent, and resource rent, this number 5 gets into that. And I thought maybe what I'd do is discuss this article in terms of the this diagram so that we kind of understand what his point was. So this is a graph called fishing effort versus revenue and cost. This is a diagram that the fisheries economists like to use. So it's an important educational technique, let's say. So Bromley is critical of the fisheries economists. So he doesn't come up with his own diagram. He uses their diagram to show them that they're wrong. So I think it's very smart, because if you use something else, well, we don't believe in that diagram. Well, he's using something that they use. So
what those letters abbreviate?
okay, so this is maximum economic yield. So just imagine this is revenue and cost. You got this cost line. This is fishing effort. So it kind of makes sense that as you have 3 levels of effort, so it might be 1 boat, 20 boats, 100 boats, number of people, those kind of things. And then this is like the revenue curve. So it's an idealized way of describing the fishing business. Who can tell me what you actually call, there's revenue and cost, there's dollars and such. Who can tell me what this amount of value is, if you read the article? I thought I heard a hand being raised. So this is how much it costs This is how much they get. So if you understand the concept of economic rent, that's what this is. So what it means is that if you're in the fishing industry and you can tell the mom and pop industry people, just stay home, become doctors and school teachers and all these other things, you don't need to be fishing because we've got it under control, thank you, and we like the extra money we're getting. That's what this difference is. The point that Bromley is making is that this line, even in their literature, means that the people doing the fishing, the people in the industry, the mom and pops, they're getting all their needs met by this revenue line. So it's like nobody's going broke. As long as there's fish to be had, the different levels of effort, what happens in a competitive market, which is what I think all schools of economy would say, this is the best thing, is that you don't have monopoly, you got a competitive market because consumers can get the lowest cost because you don't have wide swings in the economic rent, which is over and above what you need to pay your workers, put fuel in the boat, fix the boat, get the permits, all these kind of things. So if you're a monopolist, you like being back here because you're grabbing up all this money. But if people find it economically beneficial to have one boat, and this is what they do for a living, this is the industry they want to give to their kids or something, this is the point that you would achieve that, where the economic rent is no more out there. The big industry people are making their money, but also the mom and pop. So the way that the fisheries economists try to describe this diagram is that this is the maximum sustainable yield because it's the highest revenue, even though the economic rent is less here. So you can read the article, and Bromley goes into a lot of detail about what they say. In fact, if you read after the article, then the fisheries economists respond to Bromley on how he's wrong and he's out of the mainstream, blah, blah, blah. And then Bromley responds to them again. And then in 2015, he writes another paper about it. But the thing to keep in mind is that there's no say from a fisheries biologist what these points mean in terms of the sustainability. There's maximum sustainable yield, but maybe in a certain species it would be over here, it might be over there. But so this line doesn't necessarily need to come so quickly. It could go over there. This is kind of like a stylized version of trying to understand a concept. One of the things that the fisheries economists try to say is that their goal is to maximize the economic or the resource rent. That's why they talk about this, which is a totally incoherent thing to say. I'll throw out a question right now, is that what would be the resource rent in this example here? Can anybody tell me, based on the reading, what the resource rent is?
The point at which they two meet.
Well, one of the things that Bromley was talking about was that, resource rent it's kind of like one of the factors of production. So you got land, labor, capital. And in order to have a wealth to be created, you have to deploy these factors of production. So fish are a factor of production in the fishing industry. So if you're not paying for the fish, there's something wrong there. because, you know, as human beings on this planet Earth, we own those fish and we're not being compensated in a fashion. It should be our responsibility to make sure that it's being done sustainably. If there's a certain type of fish that maybe needs to be controlled more, we need to talk to biologists to advise us on how best to manage the things that we own. You know, it's illogical to turn to a monopolist and say, well, what Bromley gets into is that if we want to capture the resource rent, the way to do it would be to move in a clockwise, well, counterclockwise fashion, this line right here, where this would be C1, and then C2 would be up there. So it's like, do we have a sustainable fisheries? And the evidence in a lot of cases is no. So Bromley is suggesting you just take this line on this idealized diagram and ratchet it up. So essentially what you're doing is you're taking this economic rent out of the hands of the monopolists, and it might be represented by the amount that's paid at the dock when they show all the fish that they caught, and they pay per fish. Well, the example would be that you move this cost line such that you preclude the overfishing. So this is the line where people get into the business or get out of the business. So it's the effect of the collective, the people that are interested in the fisheries, say, well, you know, this cost line isn't capturing this economic rent. So let's move the line to there. So now what used to be economic rent is now resource rent, because we're collecting it so that we can make things sustainable. So it's not a separate thing, you know.
I understand, so you could be able to maintain
Yeah.
the oceans.
Yeah, so that's the difference between economic rent and resource rent. Now, there's not a whole lot of opportunities for there to be Ricardian rent in an ocean. Anybody want to tell me why it would be hard to have Ricardian rent in a fishery? So you understand that?
That's right. Fish move around.
Yeah. So fish move around. So if you're down there and maybe they get wind of the fact that that's how your bait looks, and that they just go someplace else. So one of the papers, actually, when I get to the next paper, I'll get into that. So that's the idea about this graph, and you can read the paper, and once you understand these principles, then you start reading about what the monopolists are talking about, and it's just if you just read their stuff from the start, it's like, okay, well, that kind of makes sense, private property, and they have an incentive to use it. But then you understand, you know, that they're describing the capture of excess profits. Then you wonder, well, isn't it better to have a competitive market? So that's the dynamic that Bromley was getting at. So taking whatever this cost and then adding to the cost, which is the capture of the natural, of the resource rent. For the purposes of this argument, I'm trying to like throw something on the wall and make it stick, and that's what this is. So if you can follow with me, that between the proposition that there's 4 times as many luxury apartments as affordable, we're probably talking somewhere on this side of this graph where we want to be, so that you talk about the rental income. And remember when I rotated this line on the fisheries where we capture the resource rent? So it's so we need to collect the socially generated revenue. So that's the mechanism for collecting the Ricardian rent from the luxury apartments, making it so that Well, you know, we've got enough luxury apartments here. You know, we don't want the historic restaurants to leave and all these other amenities that kind of define what New York is. I mean, we can get together and say stuff like that. So I was trying to come up with this idea of rationally coming up with a mechanism for saying, this is a policy that we're putting in place, and at this point, somebody comes to an application saying, oh, I'd love to have a luxury apartment on this property, and then somebody would say, oh, can you put in 2 affordable units? Oh, okay. But, you know, what's 2 affordable units? It's like, we don't need the premise that they're coming there, that we need luxury apartments. Now that I've described that as a device for how we might get at what the land value tax might be, the mechanism for getting affordable units could be the fact that there's enough vacant land in New York City where if you appropriately taxed it at the value that it is, could be, you could generate like $1 billion a year. So if you had that $1 billion or even a small fraction of that, and you put what would be considered affordable units, which if you want to say 25% of your income, and maybe the units would go for like maybe 100 or maybe 80, or, you know, small enough you could charge, you know. So that's a situation where, do we have a need for affordable housing? And the answer is yeah. Do we have vacant land that might be a good place for affordable housing? You might get it if you jacked up the tax on vacant land, because people would say, oh, well, I can't speculate anymore. Okay, well, city, here's the land. And then the city would say, well, that's great. Now I got land. I need affordable housing. Give them a tax break to build 100% affordable housing, rather than begging some luxury condo person building stuff that we don't need and then throwing a few crumbs, having 2 or 3 affordable units.
They get a tax break already.
I'm sorry?
They get a tax break already.
Well, yeah, see,
Something or another.
See, this is the tax break that they're getting, is that economic rent. You know, that here's the rate of the tax now, and I'm saying as you jack it up this way, we do away with that 421A.
Yeah.
In fact, I understand that a lot of the luxury condo developers say that they wouldn't build if they didn't have the 421A.
Yeah.
So don't give it to them. I mean, if we have enough affordable units. For next week, the group, or the half of the group that reads Rowe and Van Eaton, they're going to be focusing on this diagram, where there's 4 types of, well, it's called threshold-based ecosystem management, where there's 4 types of ecosystems. And this is something that I think is a very intelligent way of understanding ecosystem management, because it puts all the various possibilities for an ecosystem, so that if you're making policy on a large area, you're not leaving anything out. Now, the other paper was written with a very narrow focus on more wilderness areas, kind of like maybe this part of the spectrum. So I guess I want people to critique both papers on their premise and what they're trying to get at. So that's the assignment. Let me, I did want to talk.
Are we reading both papers or not?
No, why don't we go like 1, 2, 1, 2. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. Yeah, so 1 would be Rowe and Van Eaton, and if you're 2, you're going to read the Kelly article. And Ibrahima is printing out the article. So next week we're going to talk about ecosystem management. We're going to essentially finish. No, we're not going to finish poverty and progress and poverty. We're going to read chapters 21 and 32.
You said
Of
68,
what?
68 pages in this book.
What's the reading assignment from Progress and Poverty?
Progress and poverty, we're reading chapters 21 to 32.
That's for next week.
Yeah.
Originally for
Yeah.
today, but yeah.
According to that. And like what I described is that we're reading Progress and Poverty and using lessons from that to critique the materials that we're reading otherwise.
Right.
So,
You're supposed to read something else before. You said the beginning is the first 68 pages?
the first day, or for last week it was reading 68 pages, chapters 1 through 7. Today we're reading chapters 8 to 20. Next week we're reading chapters 21 and 32. So anybody not have a syllabus?
I don't know. Did you give me a syllabus? Second day.
Do you have an extra copy?
I got one.
Wait, wait,
Maybe.
Now, you said number 2 is reading the,
you have an extra?
Yeah, number 2, if you're number 2, you're reading the Kelly article. So who's got the Kelly article? Looks like everybody's got it. So you're gonna make copies of the Rowan Van Eyck now? Okay. So let's let Ibrahima finish that. I want to finish today's class on this article that appeared in the New York Times called "I'm Not Evil, I'm a Landlord." Did anybody see this? Okay. So why don't
that's his excuse.
somebody just kind of verbalize what you think this article says, just by not even reading about it. Okay.
People think that landlords are evil, so I'm not evil, I'm just a landlord. I have nothing to do with being evil.
I'm just trying to do my job.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Yanni, what do you think, just without reading it, what you think the title means?
The person tried to say that, I'm not overcharging, I'm not I'm not after people's pockets, I'm just trying to make a living, I'm a businessman and,
Yeah.
trying to make ends meet myself.
Yeah. Now, so in the article itself, he talks about, he does have a heart sometimes. He gives people like an extra week to pay the rent. Sometimes people need a loan here and there. But imagine, he's within a culture where, by and large, he can make excess. He can make economic rent and do pretty well at it. There's 4 types of ecosystems. They go from wilderness areas all the way to the other side, which is high reliability, dams, nuclear power plants, everything that takes a lot of effort to make sure you don't have accidents. That's what high reliability management is. It takes a lot of expense. So the key in this ecosystem management idea is that you try to keep as many self-sustaining management, adaptive management areas as possible, limiting human intervention, and that's how you preserve that nature as infrastructure. But when you have high reliability management, you got urban areas, even suburban areas, you need to understand that as a system. You can't just hope that the urban goes away and we all live in forests. That's not a reality. So once you understand that there's 4 types, then you can start managing nature and managing human impacts so that you get the result that you want. And that's essentially what they're trying to say. And there's five dimensions in this. Ecosystems least populated by humans, most populated. You're not extracting resources, but here you are, maybe you're mining coal or something. Ecosystem health is important. Over here, organizational health. So that's why you have a volunteer fire department, or you union wages because you want competent people, those kind of things. Multiple sources, few services, but here you have many services. So if you understand that diagram, you probably get most of the idea of the Rowan Van Eaton. Now in the Kelly article, it's focused primarily on the self-sustaining adaptive management. They talk about threshold impacts, but I think it's two different outlooks, and I wanted to get people contributing like, well, Kelly says this, and I think maybe that's a better way of looking at reality. But just keep in mind that in the Rowan Van Eaton article, they're talking about embedding themselves in, they embedded themselves in 3 major ecosystems, and they found that this way of looking at the way the ecosystems work is validated by the San Francisco Bay Delta ecosystem, the Columbia River ecosystem, and the Everglades. They found that this is a good way of operating. In the Kelly article, I'm not really sure if they're really focused on a real life situation. I think it might be more theoretical, but that's what we're going to talk about.